listener production. Hello, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. 14 members of a fringe religious group in Queensland have been convicted of the manslaughter of an 8-year-old girl in a bombshell Supreme Court ruling that was handed down yesterday.
But there are thousands of people worshipping in churches where they believe in miracles, they believe in healing, and there is an either implicit sense of avoiding medical care, or that if you choose medical care, that's because you've got a spiritual problem, your faith isn't good enough, you're not right with God.
In the second half of this episode, we find out how this tragedy happened, what this small religious group believes, and why those responsible for the death of Elizabeth Struhs were found guilty of manslaughter, but not murder. First though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Thursday, January 30.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. The Prime Minister and opposition leader have condemned a suspected antisemitic bomb plot after a caravan loaded with explosives was found at a residential property in Sydney. Police were called to the vehicle 11 days ago, finding a note displaying anti-Semitic messaging inside. It's estimated the blast zone could have been 40 metres in diameter, the New South Wales Premier calling it a potential mass casualty event.
I want to make it absolutely clear, and I understand community concerns about this story and similar escalating incidents of anti-Semitic violence in our community, that anyone attempting terrorism, violence, hatred in our community will be met with the full force of the law.
Chris Min speaking there. Counter-terror officials are now investigating the incident, a current line of inquiry into whether the explosives were obtained from a mining site. Police say some people have been arrested in connection to the suspected plot, and that while the risk has been mitigated, it has not yet been eliminated. Details as to the potential targets have not been disclosed.
Yeah, this comes after the AFP last week revealed it was investigating whether foreign actors have been paying local criminals to carry out religiously motivated attacks, which we have seen in major cities across Australia over the last few months. And this is also something New South Wales Police are yet to rule out in this incident, rule in or rule out. In a statement last night, we heard from Anthony Albanese, who has condemned the attack, saying hate and extremism have no place in Australian society. We've also heard from the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, who has called it a grave, sinister escalation in unchecked anti-Semitism. He's also called on the government to commit additional resources, including security for Jewish synagogues and for schools. Chris, this issue continues to be a boiling point, and I think it's really shaping up to form quite a part of the conversation as we head into the federal election as well.
There's a spring in Labor's step this morning after yesterday's inflation data showed it's fallen to its lowest level in 3 years. Inflation is now sitting at 2.4%. That's the lowest result since the March quarter of 2021, and better than what had been expected by the Reserve Bank. This is what economists have been waiting for as the biggest indicator yet that we will finally see the official cash rate cut from 4.35%, where it's been sitting since November of 2023. With the cost of living ranking as the biggest concern for Aussies this federal election, Anthony Albanese could take advantage of an interest rate cut to call the vote for April, with either the 5th or the 12th available.
Yeah, but that all does depend, of course, on what the RBA does. It's meeting on February 17 to make its first decision of the year. After that is when we could hear from Anthony Albanese as to whether he is going to call a federal election. Some economists are predicting a cut of 0.25%, and that could hold steady for a couple of months. They don't know whether we'd then see subsequent cuts or whether it would hold. So still a lot of question marks, but this is the biggest indicator, as you've said, that we might finally start to see some relief when it comes to the official cash rate. Look, meantime, sticking with federal politics, the PM has revealed an Australian man believed killed by Russian forces in Ukraine could be alive. Albanese has told the ABC the Kremlin has communicated the news with Australian Foreign Affairs officials.
If that is the case, it certainly would be welcome. It is something that we have demanded information on, and we are demanding more information so that we can be certain that what has been suggested is in fact the case.
Now, you might remember we spoke about Oscar Jenkins a couple of weeks back when DFAT confirmed it was looking into reports that the teacher from Melbourne was dead after he'd been captured by Russia late last year. Either way, serious concerns do still remain about the 32-year-old's well-being if he is a prisoner of war.
And a man has been convicted of drink driving a drone in what's believed to be the first case that's been successfully prosecuted in Sweden. The 55-year-old had been flying the aircraft at a classic Caravan in the town of Rättvik in a temporary no-fly zone.
Yeah, when police tracked the drone to him, he blew 0.69. The limit in Sweden is 0.2, by the way, and has subsequently been found guilty and fined 32,000 krona, which is about $4,600 Australian. So it got me wondering if the same rules exist in Australia, because it sounds weird. You hear drink driving, obviously we know is a horrible crime and you should never ever do it. But drink driving a drone, I'm kind of like, oh, who's the victim here? You know what I mean? Is it a pigeon? I don't know.
Oh, no.
I couldn't find anything on the CASA website, that's the Civil Aviation Safety Australia site, to suggest that it was an actual crime written into legislation. However, I'm sure there'd be penalties if you were caught doing the wrong thing while flying a drone and you were obviously over the limit. Either way, best to do it sober, just to be safe. But yeah, don't drink and fly?
Yeah, I know. It's interesting because it's like, even if you are sober, operating a drone is hard. Like every time I've gotten behind the wheel or the operational remote control of a drone, it's ended in disaster. I've crashed it into our house multiple times. I've crashed it into my dog, which is
Sammy.
didn't result in injury, but it like broke the drone. So, I mean, yeah, word of warning for those. And I'm sure this is something that a lot of people can relate to. Please validate me in the DMs at The Briefing Podcast if you have, been the cause of some destruction thanks to terrible operating of a drone.
Yeah, no doubt that it is hard. Chris, thank you. Next up, we are going to change pace a little bit and we're going to talk about this case out of Queensland in which an 8-year-old girl died after medication for her diabetes was withheld. A group of religious extremists have been found guilty of manslaughter with that case. Hear all about it next.
Not a moment has gone by that I haven't thought about my little sister, Elizabeth. I think the court made the right decision, and I'm relieved that those responsible were found guilty for their actions. Although we had a good outcome today, I have to acknowledge the system failed to protect Elizabeth in the first place. We are only here today because more wasn't done sooner to protect her or remove her from an incredibly unsafe situation in our own home.
Bension here, and that was Jade Struhs speaking outside the Supreme Court in Brisbane yesterday. Her sister, 8-year-old Elizabeth Struhs, died in 2022 after members of a fringe religious group in Queensland failed to give her life-saving medicine. Elizabeth's parents and 12 other members of the group, which believes in faith healing and rejects modern medicine, were all convicted of manslaughter yesterday. It's hard to believe that in 2025 in Australia there are fringe religious groups operating in this way, and an unspeakable tragedy that this little girl has died as a result. So how does something like this happen? What were the arguments in court? And why does what happened to Elizabeth count as manslaughter but not murder? Investigative journalist Rich Baker has been following the case. Rich, welcome back to The Briefing. Who was Elizabeth Struhs?
So Elizabeth was an 8-year-old girl in Toowoomba in Queensland who suffered from diabetes and required insulin to stay healthy. She was part of a family that belonged to a small church, a group that called themselves the Saints, and they were like a breakaway sect from a revival centre in Brisbane, a revival centre that sprung from the same well as the Geelong Revival Centre, which was in the listener Secrets We Keep, Pray Harder podcast.
What do we know about what the Saints believe?
So the Saints believe many similar things actually as to the Geelong Revival Centre. So they believe that God heals through prayer. They have a dislike or a distrust in the world of man, and that includes things like medicine and science, and that your real test and your real purpose is to put all of your faith in God and let Him sort things out.
How big is this group in Queensland?
This particular group, the Saints in Toowoomba, number around high 20s, around 30. It's a really small breakaway group led by a man called Brendan Stevens, who was an elder at the Brisbane Revival Centre Church. And he left after a falling out with the leadership there, or, some different points of view. And he took a few families with him. And that's where we've got to now. And really, I think perhaps got even more extreme in his views. And obviously his ability to exert control over that smaller group was greater than anything, I've probably seen.
Tell us what happened to Elizabeth.
So Elizabeth required her insulin to stay alive. And Elizabeth's mother, Kerry, was already serving a prison sentence in Queensland for previously having withdrawn her insulin in 2019. And that's obviously extremely concerning. Her father, Jason, this is Elizabeth's father, Jason, had also been charged, but had made an undertaking to the court that he would continue to provide her with her insulin. Now, this put him at odds with the beliefs of the group. And while Kerry, the wife and mother, was inside jail, Jason became more and more, I guess, leaned on to subscribe to the church's beliefs. And in January 2022, he was baptized. And after that, he decided to put his faith and his daughter's fate in the hands of God, and her insulin dosage was stopped. And she became very ill in the following days and died soon after.
What was the evidence that we heard in the trial? What was the key sets of evidence from your perspective?
Well, it was a really interesting trial because it ended up with Brendan Stevens, the pastor or the leader of this group known as the Saints, and Elizabeth's father, Jason, being charged with manslaughter, and Elizabeth's mother, Kerry, and another 11 adult members from the church being charged with manslaughter. So the father and the pastor murder, and the others manslaughter. Now, they weren't legally represented, so they represented themselves. Now, there was never any dispute that the insulin was denied. What was in dispute, I guess, was the proposition that they knew that doing so would kill her. They argued, well, no, we believed that God would save her and God would heal her. And really, that was what, on the test of murder or the charge of murder, that is what the judge had to decide. Was there overwhelming evidence to say beyond reasonable doubt that these guys knew this would result in her death, that this was an intentional killing?
Did they express remorse for her death in the courtroom?
No, there was not so much a remorse. There was a sadness, but there's also a belief amongst them that Elizabeth is only sleeping and that she may be resurrected at a time of God's choosing, and that she wanted this to happen herself, that she was willing for this to happen, and that she did not want a life of injections ahead of her. That is what they told police, and that is what they put forward to the court.
As an investigative reporter that spent a lot of time looking at groups like this, what is your reaction to this whole situation?
It's a mixture of things. There's just sadness at the waste of a young life. There was no need for Elizabeth to have died. She was very capable and very aware of her illness and what was required to keep her healthy and, not afraid of injections or anything like that from the evidence that was given. So that there's just that innate sense of waste and why did it have to get to this? And then there is some anger and bewilderment. It's a very long judgment and I'm not all the way through it and I didn't sit and hear everything unlike the judge, but it is hard to understand, I guess, as a adult without, an amazing medical knowledge or anything, that when you take someone's insulin that they need to stay well and keep alive and you take that off them, that couldn't result in anything other than death. And maybe that's an emotional reaction by me too, and not one that is going by what the law dictates. and using that standard of beyond reasonable doubt. And that means he has to exclude all other possibilities. And I guess the judge has gone down on the side that these guys, if you put yourself into their state of mind and what they believed that God would heal her, and therefore they did not intend to kill her.
How common are groups like this around Australia that reject modern medicine?
They're more common than you'd think. Now, there are varying degrees on their level of skepticism and strictness in avoiding medicine. But there are thousands of people worshipping in churches where they believe in miracles, they believe in healing, and there is an either implicit sense of avoiding medical care, or that if you choose medical care, that's because you've got a spiritual problem, your faith isn't good enough, you're not right with God. So the pressure that comes in these groups, and it's only through talking to people who've lived or been raised inside them, that we really get a sense of this creeping coercion and this groupthink. And then it's self-judgment, self-doubt about, should I do this? Is this right for me? Now, in Elizabeth's case, it's pretty clear that preference for prayer above medicine was extreme. But yeah, this type of worshipping and this style of belief and its extreme nature of it is right across Australia. It's in suburbs, in every city, and in small country towns. Everyone sort of has this image of living in a cult-like group. You have to live out in the prairies in America and all live in a compound. And it's not quite like that here, but what we do have are these cloistered communities that believe that they are exceptional, that there's something that separates them from the rest of the world. And that creates a really dangerous dynamic in health and in many other senses as well.
Do you fear that we could see another case like this anytime?
Yeah, I think there's real possibility that this could happen. What's so tragic and what makes Elizabeth's sad case so remarkable is that this is a child who really, an 8-year-old in the eyes of the law in our society, and that are not equipped to make these decisions for themselves. We wouldn't expect it anywhere else. But in these churches, yeah, I mean, I know of other examples and other cases where people have foregone treatment for treatable illnesses and ended up dying because the miracle they were expecting didn't happen. So I wouldn't be surprised to see it happen again.
Do you think that this case and this judgment will have any impact on members of other fringe religious groups around the country? Do you think that they'll even hear about it?
It depends if they, consume the media. I think this one is of sufficient public interest and gravity that it's going to be hard to avoid. And you would hope, knowing that a girl died when she didn't need to die is enough for people to think again and to maybe question what they're being led or, dare I say, coerced into doing. And I hope it opens up a forum for debate at a political level around those laws of coercion, where you have a man like Brendan Stevens, the pastor here, who members of this little community went to for guidance and for instruction. And he has been found guilty of a reckless, unlawful killing. That's something. And that should send a message to leaders of those communities and members of them about the consequences that the law, even if you think you're above the law, you're only subject to God's judgment, you're not. Society has its systems and powers that can come in and judge you. But I also hope at a political level that it opens up. People are too scared to talk about this stuff because they worry about religious freedom. And this isn't about religious freedom. This is about child safety and human rights. And, I would like this hopefully to be something, a silver lining out of it is that we can have a sensible debate that distinguishes between religious freedom and dangerous coercive control, where you have groups that are under the control of one man and his enablers that dictate the parameters of everyone else's life under them, and particularly can have dire consequences for kids who have no say.
Well, Rich Baker, thanks so much for joining us again on The Briefing.
Thanks, Ben Sid.
Investigative journalist Rich Baker there. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. Thanks for listening. We'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might want to hear it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed this afternoon from 3. I'm Ben Sion-Siebert. Catch you next time.